an uninhibited society, a 12-year-old would know most of the biology which I will have to give you in formal lectures.
Oh boy, to start a lecture, first lecture, by the way, like that? Wow, that is adventurous. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, as always, Dr. Alex Swan. Welcome to this episode. Today, we are going to be talking about sex. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, this is a podcast. Well, yeah, we're going to talk about sex. I'm not going to show sex. Jeez. Gah, that would be pornography. Anyways, today's movie is Kinsey. Kinsey came out in 2004. I'm sure you saw it. And if you haven't, it's a pretty decent one. 7 out of 10 is what it's got on IMDb, so not bad. The film stars Liam Neeson as the titular Alfred Kinsey, a groundbreaking human sexuality researcher. Was not that to start with. He studied bugs. He was an entomologist by training. Wild stuff. So Alfred Kinsey is real, just in case you had any doubts about that. Alfred Kinsey's real. The Kinsey scale, the books that came out, all real stuff in the explosive history of human sexuality in the 20th century. Like, groundbreaking research. Never been done before, and we'll get into all of that in this episode. Don't you worry. The movie was written and directed by Bill Condon, pretty famous director in the world, the Hollywood world, I suppose. Film also stars Laura Linney as Claire McMillan, Mac, his wife, Kinsey's wife, excuse me. Chris O'Donnell, Peter Sarsgaard, and Timothy Hutton all play his research assistants. Not graduate research assistants, from what I can tell, but paid research assistants. Some of his closest and trusted confidants. Some other really big names that are in this movie. Tim Curry has a bit role as somebody, a sort of a rival faculty member at the University of Indiana. Oliver Platt, I think, either plays the dean of IU or like the provost. Some heavy hitter, has a lot of conversations with the board of trustees. What it looks like, of course. Dylan Baker is in it as well, and William Sadler. But I think the biggest name that you're like, wait, that person's in it? John Lithgow. John Lithgow plays Alfred Kinsey Sr., although I don't think they have this fully the same name. And so he wasn't Alfred Kinsey Jr. I don't believe that is the case. So, and then there are some great bit parts from a lot of famous people that have exploded careers. One of my favorite ones, though, is John Krasinski, and he has an early meeting with Dr. Kinsey before Kinsey goes on this big old cross-country sex study He just comes in with his newlywed wife, and they're having sex problems, and they think that he's a good place to ask questions. He seems open, and word spreads, that kind of thing, and it's a great. This is right before John Krasinski blew up being in the office, being Jim in the office. So it's great. And there are a few others throughout. If you, like I said, if you haven't seen it, there aren't really many spoilers. Sort of the last, I don't know, third of the movie sort of quickly speeds up and time advances. Most of the work or the time period that's set in the film precedes the 1948 release of his male volume, the first of two male sexual activities and behaviors. And so we have work before that, and then we have years after that. It's really hard to tell how much time has spanned from the beginning of the movie to the end, like the main setting from when he starts, teaching and meets Mac at Indiana University when she's a student, and he's teaching people about his wasps, I think is what they are. So we're going to get into all of this. Its relationship with psychology is immense. There is a massive amount of academia present in this movie, just like the ins and outs of getting a grant and being able to fund research. And, it takes you back to today when you have to ask for money to do your research. Yeah. So things haven't changed in academia, and you still have to publish quite a bit to make a name for yourself. Still not going to get that respect, though, that he so desperately wanted. Nope, did not get that one at all. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our chat on Kinsey. And we are here with my guest host today. My guest host is Leslee Koritzke. Leslee is a lifelong educator, LA native, yes, and self-professed movie nerd, also yes. She attended Cal State University Northridge for both undergrad and grad school. Me too. Her master's is in educational psychology and counseling. She's worked at several community colleges in the LA area and has been at LA Trade Technical College for the last 26 years. She's been a transfer counselor, curriculum chair, curriculum dean, articulation officer, and a psychology professor, where we find her today. She has created the courses that she's wanted to teach: psychology of women, social psychology, and of course, psychology in film. Leslee, welcome to the show.
I am so excited to join you today.
I am happy to have you on. So, as I do with all of my guest hosts joining me for a film, is to ask, and sometimes we get a person on like you who teaches film in this kind of the same way that I like to. So I want to ask your thoughts about film and what you like about film in general, and what prompts you to use film in your classes.
Well, I love film because maybe it's because I live in Los Angeles. We do have the industry here. We can go see movie previews. We can do all kinds of things related to movies. And I just love them. They make me happy. What can I say? I use films with my teaching, mostly because I love film and I want to just share my love of it with my students, but I don't teach an actual film class or an art class, so I get to do it in the context of psychology.
That's excellent, because that's part of the reason that I like to do it too. Film makes me happy, it makes me enthused. So my question is then, much along those same lines, is the enthusiasm sort of infectious?
Oh, I hope so, because I get to movie nerd over all kinds of things and little teeny details. So when we watch A Beautiful Mind, for example, I can talk about, hey, this is really the first time when Paul Bettany worked with Jennifer Connelly, and then they got married.
Oh,
Right?
that is a nice, interesting tidbit.
It is a little tidbit. Or when we watch A Clockwork Orange, and Alex is going through the record store, and there's actually a little poster for 2001: A Space Odyssey,
Yes, I
also
love that.
directed by Kubrick. So,
Right.
not to mention one of the actors in that movie, David Prowse, became Darth Vader.
Yes, that is right. He became Darth Vader just a 5 years later, thereabouts.
Exactly.
Yeah, pretty amazing bits of tidbits. I also like sharing film techniques. So I'm a film technique nerd, in addition to all of these little connections that directors and writers and actors like to do in their movies. So I like to point out like techniques. So a Dutch angle, for example, or zooming really into people's faces and constantly holding the massively close up shot and what that does for the viewer. So just little things like that to try to just show that we're not just watching a movie to grab psych techniques. There really is an art form to this, right?
Right, and they also use music to manipulate our emotions.
Yes, that's a good one. You know, the shrieking violin. Oh, that gets me every single time. Gets me every time. Just I just know my heart is pounding when I hear the violin, just the and the quiet violins too. Oof, chills. No,
Just
literally chills.
the theme of Jaws to this day can make people afraid to go into the ocean.
Yeah. I wonder if you take a naive group on that one. So people who haven't seen Jaws and see whether or not it would impact them going in the water.
But maybe to a point, because they've still heard about it, even if they've never actually seen the movie.
I do
because
this.
It's been in pop culture. I'm sure I haven't seen every episode of The Simpsons, but I'm willing to bet it's there.
Okay, Leslie, now that we've stopped our nerding out on film techniques, let's pivot to our current discussion. We're going to talk Kinsey today. Film came out almost 20 years ago. And so I was curious as to, we went back and forth on what movies to do for our chat today. And you mentioned Kinsey, and I was like, you know what? We haven't really we have done a couple of biopics of psychological figures before, Zimbardo and a few other people. Zimbardo most recently, eventually Milgram. But you brought up Kinsey, and I was like, you know what? That's a good one because we haven't really talked about human sexuality on the show yet, and I thought it was a good one to use for our discussion. But I also wanted to know for our listeners, why do you include it in your psych and film class? Why was it at the top of your list?
Okay, so I teach my psychology and film class really as paired up with my psychology 1. So all of the films I choose really relate to the same chapters that we're doing in Psychology 1. What's the first chapter? Research methods.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, how fun is it to get something that not only discusses research methods, something where we can discuss ethics, because that's also a big chapter 1 sort of discussion. And let's not do something boring. Let's throw the sex out there right out of the gate. First movie we watch. Why not?
Excellent. I mean, it hits all of those things. And yeah, we're going to talk quite a bit about the research methods of Kinsey. And it, this really as a human sexuality discussion would be in maybe a psych of gender class or a psych of women's studies class or really a human sexuality class, depending on if you've got that at your school. So there are really two different worlds that you can use here. And I think in some ways it mirrors the Stanford Prison Experiment film name, because not only is it an exploration of research methods and the ethics of doing such things, but you can also just talk about the social psychology of what Zimbardo was trying to show. He didn't do it properly, but at least he was doing something. At least these are concepts that we can talk about. And so I think Kinsey sort of set the stage on that one a decade prior. So yeah, that's a great reason to use this film in your class. I didn't include it when I taught psych and film because I had a summer session, and so I only had 4 weeks. So it is going to probably enter the rotation, though.
Hello, I'm Dr. Alfred Kinsey from Indiana University, and I'm making a study of sex behavior.
All right, Leslie, let's jump into the meat of it then, if that's all right with you.
Let's do it.
So I want to take a chronological look at this film. So the film centers around the year 1948, which is when his first volume on male sexual behaviors and anatomy was released. And so we have the preceding years up to that time, 2 or 3 years. It's really hard to tell with the passage of time. But because we hear about his children being born, but then in the middle of the movie, they're all sort of teenagers and or going to college. So it's really hard to tell how much the film covers as far as time goes. But
That's
then
true.
After 1948 is sort of the last 30 minutes of the movie or so after the book comes out, and what happens after the book comes out with the research while they're trying to get the female volume, the second volume out, and all of that stuff. And then sort of the film speeds up and then wraps up. So
That's what it does.
Leslie, for the audience, can you describe who Alfred Kinsey was and the kind of scholar he was and the work that he did, just in general?
Okay, so Alfred Kinsey was actually an entomologist. He was studying this bug called a gull wasp. And he was looking at how they were spreading out from one location to another, which included some of their mating because they could only move so far, which is actually kind of funny. But it actually didn't seem to actually thrill him all that much. He did the work. He plowed away at it. But what seemed to really interest him were students coming to him and asking him questions about other things, like sex. And he thought, hey, maybe this is a direction I can go to research people's behavior, because he was coming at it from a biology point of view, not a social scientist perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to make, that he was an entomologist, and so he didn't really have the theoretical background a social scientist at the time would have. Maybe that helped him, maybe that hindered him. I would say that from the film's perspective, his inability to speak articulately and understanding who your audience is, as perhaps a social scientist would be able to navigate. He was very blunt about it. Maybe people like that about him. We meet a woman at the very end of the movie who thanks him for, quote unquote, saving her life because of writing about homosexuality, which nobody was really talking about in the 1940s. And so she was a lesbian, and his writings, his books, saved her from dying by suicide. So, I mean, for all of the things that he did, which we'll get into, the movie does paint him as a sort of hero figure for advancing the conversation of sexuality in the United States.
He did have to really walk a really thin line because we're talking about a time where we had the Red Scare, the House Un-Americans Committee. He had to really make sure that he wasn't being looked at as being essentially un-American for bringing up a topic that most Americans do not discuss in public.
Yeah, and the movie portrays it rather, I would say, speciously by saying that it's so easy to get grants. It's not really.
Yeah, but he had to play a lot of games with the Rockefeller Foundation to get them to continue funding him, and they didn't want him to say anything that was over the top.
Yeah, an untoward and anti-puritanical notions at the time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's important now that we understand who Kinsey was, why he thought, you know what, I'm going to abandon all of this gull wasp stuff and completely divert my efforts to sort of upending the entire conversation of sex in the United States for many decades to come, and including the research invention of the Kinsey scale. So some things that led him to his work, as portrayed in the film by John Lithgow. His father is a really dogmatic preacher, and he wants his sons to excel in everything, but then also become preachers.
Right. But he was very controlling, and his mother was very passive. And so growing up, looking at those relationships obviously affected his own development later on, especially when it came to how he was going to have a relationship with his wife. I mean, who was his role model on marriage.
Exactly. And his struggle with the religious teachings as a Boy Scout. We get a glimpse of his past as a Boy Scout and talking to his brother about masturbation, and then we see masturbation. Then we see Alfred masturbate that night, and feeling really, really bad about it.
He was told it was a terrible thing. And especially when later on, when we get the story of his father and how his father was treated, it's no wonder that he's been taught this entire time that masturbation is wrong.
Yeah, that is a pretty powerful scene where Kinsey's father admits to chronically masturbating and then having to be, essentially disallowed from touching himself by having to wear a strap.
Some kind of binding.
Yeah. I would imagine that it just covers the whole area, and maybe there's a pee hole, I guess. Yes, there would have to be, really.
Yeah, the male version of a chastity belt.
Yeah, pretty much. And I would imagine that erections were very uncomfortable for a contraption that of that time period, of that type. So, very traumatic experience that his father has, and this trauma then gets transformed into religious dogma, and the other psychological part of it, which is the need to control his sons.
Yeah, and Kinsey grew up with this, but it really does seem like, as he's pursuing his own research, that he's throwing all of that away.
Yeah,
all of it.
He is doing a great example of reactance in the sense that he's doing the exact opposite of all of the things that he was taught to do and taught to be as a child. He's just 180 the whole thing.
Exactly. Yet he still went back to his family, had dinner with his parents, and still was looking for approval from his father, which he must have known he was not going to get.
Yeah, that's always rough. It's always rough for me to see that, because in many ways I feel for that person, but then at the same time I also know intellectually you're right, not going to get it. And he ultimately apologizes to his father after learning this about this masturbation treatment, because it represented a profound shift in their relationship. So that's one of the precursors to his work. You mentioned Mac, and so what is another precursor to the work that they show so very, I think, very fun and very cute way in the movie?
So you're talking about their little meet cute.
Well, just the whole thing about how they blossom into this sexually open situation. So this is sort of like part of the reason why he goes on this journey.
Well, it seems much more open about her self-confidence, her sexuality. She seems much more open and is able to sort of lead him along to also be more open. It would have been interesting to learn more about Mac's childhood and her relationship with her parents and what did she learn as a kid, because clearly she had a very different upbringing than Kinsey did.
Yeah, that makes sense. But of course, the movie's called Kinsey.
It's true. It's not called Mac.
Yeah. So, in light of their openness, they had some problems in the beginning, right?
Oh, they did. Actually, one of my favorite scenes is when they're trying to have sex. It's painful, and they go to a doctor.
Dr. Kinsey, how large is your penis?
Excuse me?
When erect, how large is it? How long from the scrotum? Here? 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 Surprised you didn't pass out.
It's a very funny scene.
And this is why I think the whole presentation of this is represents healthy behaviors in a couple. And why I think it's cute and funny is because everybody's face is just so sheepish, and they're like, "Oh, this is so embarrassing." And then the doctor's like, because there's an issue with her hymen or something like that.
And he's going to surgically cut it so it's not as painful.
Right. Yeah. And he was like, this is super routine, happens all the time. Oh, it was a great line to end that just like little vignette of them trying to figure out, and then it cuts to them just having vigorous sex. Which,
on the bed, on the floor.
Yeah,
wherever.
They were just enjoying it. They were like, she's healed now. Let's see if this fixes it, and apparently it does.
Apparently so.
Now, another thing that you mentioned, Leslie, is what happens to Kinsey as he's, teaching just regular bug stuff with students. I think this is an important precursor to his work.
Yeah, it is. And, students were asking him questions on all these things unrelated to the gall wasp, which is actually very sweet, because as an instructor, you want to have this relationship with your students where they like you, they're free to feel free to talk to you, and they certainly did.
Yeah. It's just, and the way that they play this out is that he gets a nickname.
Proc.
Proc.
Yes.
And he describes it as a short way to say Professor K. And because, it's a nice, really sharp syllable at the end, Proc. We have we just have a name that he gets to carry, and it just makes him seem more personable to these students, and it immediately builds rapport when he can just say, "I'm Proc, you can call me Proc." Imagine how many semesters he went through being, "I'm Proc."
Yeah. Well, what's funny though is that most of my students call me Mrs. K.
Okay.
No one wants to say Koritzke. So, but I tell them, I said, you can call me Professor, you can call me Mrs. K, you can call me Mom, I'll probably answer. And so it's like, let's just relax, we're going to have fun, you're going to be okay.
Would you, at this stage of your career, would you also allow Proc, since you are Professor K?
I am Professor K, that would be fun.
I'd give it a go the next time you teach psych and film.
Why not?
Yeah, if it's the first movie that you start with, what an exciting movie to start with, by the way. But yeah, you could just say, he's Proc and I'm Proc.
So am I.
I think that would be amazing.
Yeah, I should give it a shot.
So another precursor to Kinsey's work that I wanted to note is at Indiana University in 1940 something. We don't really know when that is. It's just prior to the first book coming out. So in 1940 something, we are given the academic tour of the biology, I guess, department or some conglomeration of arts and sciences. And we meet Tim Curry's character who teaches hygiene.
And he does it in the most boring. He makes it as boring as humanly possible, doesn't he?
Yeah, he really does. And not to mention, there's one black person in the class, and he goes out of his way to other this guy by mentioning how and is in his hygiene class, while boring, also super gross because it's just about STIs.
Yeah, he's very offensive.
Yeah, he goes out of his way to make a racist comment about the difference between black and white men, about the rates of STIs and things like that. It's like, whoa! And even Oliver Platt's character, who I don't know if he's the dean or the president or something of Indiana University, but he did not like that comment either.
Yeah, I think he was a dean. That was my sense.
Mm-hmm.
And he's trying his best to try to lead people to do the right thing, but he also doesn't want to step on any toes because funding is funding. We don't want to lose our funding.
Yeah. There's a scene at the end of the movie, and I'm not going to be able to include it. Apologies, dear listener. I'm not going to be able to include it because I can't find it, and I'm not going to pay for the movie again. But he's at a dinner trying to get funding after the Rockefeller Foundation kicks his butt to the curb. And he's at this nice soiree dinner with a bunch of rich philanthropists or whatever. And he just blurts out, "You don't know how hard I've worked forever and how poorly I've been treated." And I was just like, that is every single academic trying to get a grant right now.
Oh, it's
please,
true.
Please, NSF, you don't know how hard I've worked.
Just bless me.
I was like, this encapsulates academia right now. Okay, all right. Getting it in the early 1950s. Just getting it going.
Oh, it was probably there for all of eternity. When Plato and Socrates were teaching, they were probably fighting for funding.
That's true. That is very true. They were probably petitioning the local government. Can I just have some research space? Sorry, I don't think we got that space for you, Plato. You gotta go find a cave. So we have poor sex education at a college. And I believe Indiana University is a public land grant university. I could be wrong about the land grant thing, but I'm
believe it is.
pretty sure that it's public university in Indiana. So, I mean, we're talking to like, if it's going to be taught, it's going to be taught at a place like this. But all they had as far as sex education was if you have sex, you're going to get gross things on your penis. Because only men were in this class. It was not co-ed from what I could tell.
It didn't seem like it. This is also a time where the stereotype is that women were going to college for their MRS degree.
Mm-hmm.
So were they going to further a career? Was there still an expectation that they would remain housewives? So even though during World War II, a lot of women were absolutely working while the men were off at war, after the war, when the men came back, the expectation was that the women would return to the kitchen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. And for, in fairness, Mac is portrayed, and whether this is accurate or not, as far as real life goes, is portrayed as a housewife.
She is.
Yeah.
But she may be a housewife, but she is not subservient in any way. And that's one of the things I actually really love about the movie is that she is supporting him from the home front, but she is not subservient to him.
True. Yeah, I agree. So we have poor sex education, and like I said, in this hygiene class, also, why do you need a class on hygiene?
Was it a requirement for graduation?
Yeah, you know what? It probably was, considering what the graduations for requirements used to be in general education, even when I was in college. I'm like, why do I have to take this class? This is ridiculous. So I can only imagine 80 years ago what it was, what nonsense people had to take. That really did nothing for them. Other than you could have probably just read a book or watched somebody teach you how to clean yourself. I don't know. Hygiene. Euphemism, apparently.
Hand them a pamphlet and a condom and send them on their way.
Exactly. But also, Tim Curry's character says at a meeting for, I don't know, the department or the arts and sciences, says that, abstinence education is the only way to teach sex, which is literally saying don't teach sex.
When I was a kid, they would pull the kids out in 5th grade, and the boys went into one room and the girls went into another room, and they gave them the talk. Mm-hmm. Then after that, of course, they may have changed the talk ever so slightly to the point where they hand you a little bag that has deodorant in it. Mm-hmm. And the boys got the one speech, the girls got the other. Nobody knew what the other speech was. We didn't know. Not really.
Unless you asked, I suppose.
I suppose unless you asked. But even so, sitting in that 5th grade little pull-out movie thing, whatever they showed people, nobody was really listening. They were too busy being nervous and giggling and elbowing each other, your friends. Nobody's really listening. And I'm willing to bet in the 1940s, they did not do that for kids in 5th grade.
No, I doubt that, because
7th grade.
because they weren't doing it for adults. I mean, we're talking about college students in this movie who are not getting sexual education. Like, these are adults who are getting married and ostensibly having children. I mean, how is population going to expand if people aren't having kids? I mean, people are clearly having sex.
But what perhaps it's on their wedding night, the saying that on their wedding night, the mother says to her daughter, the bride, just lay back and think of England.
Oh my. That's really rough.
No one explains what an orgasm is. Mm-mm. They don't know what are the expectations. They they're being told that sex is for procreation only.
Yeah, and much to as we wrap up this, these precursors to this valuable work, there's no discussion of whether or not it should hurt. Now, it shouldn't, of course, but in some cases it does. And when you don't tell people that this might be a possibility, they end up thinking terrible things about themselves. Like, in that scene where on Proc and Mac's wedding night, he gets incredibly distraught because he's hurt his new wife, and he's like, I can't do this pleasurable thing for her. I've masturbated, but it wasn't necessarily pleasurable. It felt like an urge, but I felt so much shame about it. And now he can do this sanction thing, and it devastates him.
Yeah, well, when they go to the doctor, and she tells the doctor that she's experiencing this pain, and the doctor says, well, we can do this little surgery. It's easy. It's not a problem. I really wonder, though, how many people went to their doctors and said, this hurts. Or did they mostly suffer in silence because they thought, this is what it is, I guess?
And that nobody told them that it shouldn't be that way, or that anybody even knows that it shouldn't be that way. At the time, of course. We had history of Greeks and Romans and the discussion of sex as a pleasurable experience, but people were so far removed from those days, and how much the church impacted how people learned about these unsanctioned things, that, maybe that collective knowledge of this should be a pleasurable thing was lost. And women weren't going to their doctors, either out of shame, embarrassment, or just ignorance.
Yeah, probably so. Unless they traveled abroad. Perhaps if they went to France or Italy, they would have learned something different.
Perhaps, yeah, exactly. So those are the ways in which the film portrays the reasons why Kinsey goes about doing this human sexuality work. It really is a culmination of his experiences with his father, his youth, the dogmatic Christianity in which he was raised, and then just the absolute fundamental lack of education adults were getting, that he knew better about. He knew better. And so he decides, damn it, I'm going to do the largest sex study ever. And before we jump into that biggest, at least at the time, study of sex, let's take a quick break, and we'll be back talking Kinsey with Leslee Koritzke. Howdy. Thanks for listening to this episode. We hope you're enjoying the conversation. Over the past 2 years, the podcast has grown, and that's mostly in part to folks like you, the listeners. We've also had wonderful luck receiving support from the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, APA Division II Small Partnerships Grant. It's been a fun ride, and we want to keep it going. So we need your help. There are several ways that you can support this show. You can share episodes with your social media networks so we can grab new listeners. You can join our fledgling Patreon program. You can contribute directly using PayPal, or you can purchase some sweet merchandise with our logo at our Spreadshirt merch store. All of those things can be found on the website cinemapsychpod.swanpsych.com. But perhaps the best thing that you can do is to keep listening and leave us feedback on Facebook or Twitter so we know you've listened. Thanks. And now back to the show. And we are back talking Kinsey, 2004 movie starring Liam Neeson as the titular character, with Leslee Koritzke. Now, Leslie, I had primed the viewer before we stopped for the break that all of these precursors led to Kinsey's groundbreaking study, Kinsey and his colleagues, in this big old study on sex behaviors and anatomy. So for the listeners, what was the broad methodology of this study?
Okay, so Kinsey was using this survey method, but rather than doing it with paper and pencil, he was having his lab assistants do these interviews with thousands upon thousands of people. And he trained his lab assistants how to ask the questions, which questions to ask, how to make notations so that it would be very objective. He was trying to leave subjectivity out of it. I think that kind of crashed and burned as things went along. But he did start with a very objective method for asking these questions. And he started, of course, just asking men. Later on, he also asked women, but he wanted to ask as many people as humanly possible to find out what their backgrounds were, first of all, what behaviors they've actually engaged in. He also asked them what they fantasized about and if that actually led to some of the behaviors. Because as a biologist, he's really mostly looking at the behaviors,
Right.
not some of all these other ancillary things, but they all did come along later on. So he started with this survey method with these interviews.
I'd like to begin with a few background questions.
No, all wrong. Start by putting the subject at ease. Would you care for a drink, Mac?
Oh, a glass of water would be very nice.
Do anything fun this weekend?
My daughters were in town, so I never stopped. We had a marvelous meal Saturday night.
Really? What did you cook?
Well, I started with a little...
See how much more relaxed she's become? If you ease in with innocuous questions, people forget they're giving sex histories.
How did you first find out about masturbation?
I invented it, son.
Sometimes I tie a rope around my balls when I jerk off.
And what other masochistic acts do you enjoy?
Does that mean queer?
How often do you have intercourse?
2 or 3 times.
A month?
No, a day.
Oh. How often do you reach orgasm?
Once.
A day?
No, only once. About 20 years ago, I was sitting on a piano stool listening to music.
Oh, that's good.
How old were you when you first engaged in sexual activity with a partner?
14.
How?
With horse.
How often were you having intercourse with animals at age 14?
It's true. The pony. You are a genius. How did you know?
You just said you had sex with a horse.
No. Horse. Not horse. Horse.
Later on, though, he was inviting people into the lab. He was videotaping people actually in the act of sex.
Mm-hmm.
And he started wanting to know what was normal, average, because they didn't know what that meant anyway. And he realized very quickly that there is no such thing as normal or average when it comes to sexual behavior.
Right.
And it actually led him to learn a lot more about how broad the world of homosexuality, bisexuality, all of those things were even back then. It might have been very in the closet. People weren't talking about it, but they were doing it.
Right. There's some really significant things here to unpack. Right. So let's take that last one regarding homosexuality. So one of the biggest things that came out of this research is what is referred to as the Kinsey scale, a scale from 0 to 6 that describes on a unidimension a person's proclivity for homosexual behavior at 0. And, or was that?
Yes, it was
0.
Heterosexual was at 0.
Heterosexual.
And homosexual behavior was at 6.
There we go.
And then he scaled it in between. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 was, I've mostly done this with a smattering of that.
Right.
or I've equally engaged in both heterosexual and homosexual behaviors.
This rating scale of yours? 0 to 6.
0 being exclusively heterosexual and 6 being exclusively homosexual. A great many people line up somewhere in the middle.
What makes you think that's true?
Common sense. Remember, about a third of our heterosexual histories have homosexual acts, and vice versa.
Right. I guess I'm about a 3, huh?
Based on your sexual history, I'd say that's right.
How about you?
I suppose I've been a 1 or 2 most of my life, even though it's taken a long time to recognize it.
And now?
Probably 3.
And that scale was used for a very long time afterward. I don't know how much it's used these days because of all of the new and better ideas about gender, sexual orientation, and as well as like just attraction in general, physical attraction versus psychological attraction, gender identity, all of these different kinds of things that I think a single scale doesn't really capture it. For behavior, maybe, but I would say it's pretty hard pressed to find. But I mean, if there's anyone out there that knows more about how the Kinsey scale is used today, please let me know. You can email me, or you can tweet at us, SinSciPod, or you can message me on Facebook, just either me or at Cinema Psych Pod, SinSciPod as well. Because I'd be interested to know. I have been trying to get a human sexuality course at my college, but I wanted it to be team taught with a biologist, sort of half and half.
That would be interesting.
And I was going to be doing it, but then the biologist that I was going to be doing with left the college. So, hopefully another biologist comes along and wants to do that, because I think that would be really, really, really fun. Anyways, that's a small digression. So the homosexuality comes up with the Kinsey scale. The movie portrays a very fluid sexuality with many of the characters, but majorly focusing on Kinsey himself. And apparently they end up with an open marriage, and so do all of his lab assistants end up with open marriages.
There's a scene at a barbecue where all the lab assistants and their wives are all talking about who's going to have sex with who, and introducing the new fiance of one of the lab assistants, and the expectation is that she'll play along.
Yeah.
I certainly hope before they got married they had a big discussion about that was the expectation in the marriage.
Yeah, and I think Timothy Hutton's lab assistant character sort of spells that out for the viewer. Sort of says, all of our wives are pretty much on board with what we're doing here, and we see that there are issues arise. Mac isn't too happy about Kinsey's homosexual encounter with one of his lab assistants. But apparently they reconcile because she ends up having a fling with the same guy. So it's a lot of really dynamic relationships going on throughout the course of this, and as you mentioned, Leslie, he tries to keep the study objective, but he doesn't do a very good job because of all of this bleeding from personal stuff that comes into it.
Yeah. One of the interesting conversations I have with my students is, should a researcher be personally involved in their research? And the funny thing is how many students really fall into these opposite ends. One student might say they should be completely objective and have zero personal interest at all in the topic, but other students will say, no, but it makes it, once they're closer to the topic, maybe they can do a better job because they have their own personal perspective, and I have to have a whole conversation about experimenter bias.
Mm-hmm.
And how much of that really did affect Kinsey's study and what he created with his books at the end.
Yeah, I agree, and that gets us down into the ethics thing. So we'll hold on to that one tight. One of the other things that you mentioned in your overview, Leslie, was that he created this survey method. Can you tell us a little bit more about the survey method and the training that his lab assistants had to do?
Yeah, so he had his lab assistants ask him, Proc, the questions so that way he could say, wait, let's try this a little bit of a different way. He really wanted them well trained. So he had them start with demographic data and collecting that to try to relax the participants. So this is easy. I'm just giving my name, my age, a little bit of my background, so they would relax a little bit. And then they would ask slowly more and more detailed questions. So by the end, they were asking all these questions about the participants' sexual behavior that they could never have asked as the first question.
Right. That I think people would just clam up immediately.
Absolutely. As he was training all of his lab assistants, he would slowly make adjustments to what questions were being asked and how they were being asked. So in some ways, when you look at the variables for his study, they actually shifted over time. So can you really compare the data for the later participants to the early ones if he keeps changing the questions?
Yeah, not very good research design.
No, but it's still, he tried. He really did try to come up with an objective method for asking these questions, for coming up with this coding system so that if anybody looked at someone's sheet afterwards of what they said, there was no identifying information.
Yeah, that's important, so, right? Kept it confidential, and it's mentioned that that was a crucial part of the interview process, that people knew that they weren't going to get dinged by their friends and family and people that knew them, that they had these engaged in these what they thought was odd sexual behavior.
Right. One of the difficulties with any kind of survey or that sort of thing where you're asking people for really personal information is that you only can get as much good data as the volunteers you manage to, get out of the woodwork. How many people didn't volunteer? What would they have said? So was he really getting a true random sample if these are only the people who were interested in participating in the study?
Yeah. I see your note here that 25% of his participants were prisoners.
Yeah,
in real life.
Yes, they were prisoners. And now, of course, we have all kinds of protections in place for protected populations to participate in research. But back then, there was really none of that.
Yeah.
Did they have institutional research boards back then?
This is pretty sad. As far as an ethics standpoint goes, as far as the timeline goes. The Nuremberg Code, which many of our current ethical guidelines are based on, was only a couple of years old when the Kinsey's first book came out in 1948. So there was very little of anything. And as far as the code goes, his research didn't qualify. Because it was survey methods.
Okay, got it.
Right, the Nuremberg Code was
experimental group and control group.
Yeah, the Nuremberg Code was specifically for like making changes to a person, so to speak. So like having them ingest something, sticking them with a needle, doing any kind of surgery. It was really meant as a response to what the Nazis were doing to humans, which was gnarly and awful. And so there was nothing else. So if you were doing a survey method like this, you basically only needed the approval of the legal body, so his superiors, the dean and whatnot at Indiana University, and which he does get through like this marriage course that he creates, and the funding source. That was basically it.
That was it. So he could ask anybody to be a participant. I'm not sure how he got those prisoners. How he, did he approach one prison in particular? I don't know. But it makes you sort of question a little bit of his data.
Yes, and considering that if a quarter of them were men in prison, then this creates a skew, as you put it, in the sexual behaviors, because these men don't have access to women to engage in heterosexual behaviors, except for, the what are they called? Conjugal visit.
Conjugal visit. But how many people really had conjugal visits?
Yeah, see, that's what I mean. Do we even know that conjugal visits were sort of allowed in the mid-1940s when he was collecting the data on these men in prison? Like, probably not. So if they were engaging in sex acts, it likely would have been male to male sex acts. So does that increase the rate of homosexual behaviors? Well, obviously. Was that representative of people in the United States? Maybe. We didn't really know about homosexuality at that time. And it's said that trying to get Kinsey to stop this, that J. Edgar Hoover, the sort of original director, the crazy director of the FBI, was putting together communism dossiers. And
J. Edgar Hoover, who was also a transvestite.
Yes, he was also. Yes, so he also had his own
skeletons in his closet.
Ideas that he thought were different from the norm, and he was hiding those. Very parallel figure to Kinsey's father, at least in the movie. They don't reference Hoover's private activities in the movie. It's just that he's putting together dossiers of homosexual behavior among Kinsey and his lab assistants, and how that was basically going to just tank the whole project just because of how bad that was in at this point, the early 1950s.
Our attitudes about this have changed so much. So after Kinsey's research, they essentially divided sexuality into 4 very nice, neat, clean categories. You were either heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, or asexual.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. The 4 categories. And now we really can see that it's an entire spectrum of behaviors, of desires. But back then, it was very clear cut to them. Either you were or you were not.
Yeah. And I mean, Kinsey is part of the reason for this, because his 2 volumes, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. So he sets up the dichotomy, the sex dichotomy from the start, right? He doesn't allow for any nuance in there. He has no idea any of the men that he talked to or the women that he talked to were potentially trans, or that their chromosomes weren't the XX, XY, false dichotomy that exists out there. And so he wasn't reporting on that, but it also makes sense that it came out to 4 categories, but because that's how you cross a dichotomy, right? You get male only, female only, male, female, and no one. Which from an educational standpoint is very limiting because it ignores all the variation that exists at all levels, genetic all the way up to, macro phenotype.
Exactly. So today we can show the genderbread person to our students.
I fancy the gender unicorn myself.
Okay. But just as some way of opening up the discussion that how someone presents themselves can be different than what their genetics say, can be different from who they have relationships with. So it's all on a spectrum. And the whole idea of gender conformity, we are slowly changing.
Yes. Slowly, the operative word there. Ugh. But I then ask you, Leslee, as we pivot the discussions a little bit, because we mentioned the ethics of this. So, what would be different if this study were conducted today? If the whole thing was just like, hey, we need a new deep dive into human sexuality, what would that look like today?
Well, first of all, would we do it as these one-on-one interviews? Mm-hmm. Probably not. It's not very efficient.
It's very expensive. As Kinsey repeatedly asks for money in the movie.
Right. You have to pay a lot of people to do these things. So it's not very efficient. And it's also not objective because what if one lab assistant says something slightly differently than the next one? You could end up with different responses. So we would probably create an online survey, throw it out there to the universe. Now we have all these computers that could calculate our data for us. How convenient is that? Thank you very much, technology. We would still have the same issue of who is volunteering. Because are you really getting a random sample of the population?
Yeah. So to get a really good random sample of sexual activity, you kind of just have to ask everyone.
Yeah, you really do. You really do. And you have to make it clear that it is open to everyone, regardless of gender, race, that you want everyone who can possibly participate.
Yes, and make sure that historically underrepresented groups, which is the case in the original 2 volumes, the male volume that came out in 1948 and the female that came out a couple of years later. It really is not very diverse. They do try to show a diverse group in the movie, but that's not when they're going all over the place.
They show this map with all these faces popping up.
But it wasn't really that diverse, was it?
Well, not only was it not that diverse, but his lab assistants were not diverse. He only had male lab assistants. They all appeared to be white, cis male lab assistants. So that actually can also skew the results if you're doing these one-on-one interviews. How comfortable would someone who's gender queer be talking to one of these lab assistants or person of color? It can change the results that you get. So today, creating an objective online study, perhaps with an opening image that shows people of various races, genders, presentations, etc., to give the message that everyone is welcome. There would be ways to do it.
Yeah, I think there would be.
But the way Kinsey did it, he did a great groundbreaking job, but it wouldn't be adequate for today.
No, and I think it for all the fervor around an ongoing theme in the movie, which is the word normal. For all the fervor around normal, while it does do a really good job of bringing this taboo subject to the light and really grinded the gears of a lot of people who I sort of would have reveled getting their gears grinded. You know, somebody like Senator McCarthy or something like that. Just seeing him get so worked up about this man teaching sex. I think I would love that if I were there at the time with my current brain.
I mean, he ended up on the cover of Life magazine. There was a lot of publicity about his books. So, with all that publicity, a lot of buttons were getting pushed.
He could have done a better job of making sure that everyone was comfortable. I can imagine the women who came to the lab likely felt uncomfortable being surrounded by a bunch of men. And being asked these very personal questions. It is very rough, and I think your idea of making it not in front of a human being is probably the best idea.
We like objectivity in our data.
Yes. This whole idea of normal doesn't really exist, because normal is really what you do typically. But what this study did was shine a light on what is more common than people thought. Even though they ask the question, is this normal? I mean, the response to that is, I don't know, and we probably will never know. But it might be typical. It might be average. What do you mean by average, though? Well, it's not. It's somewhere in the middle. It's mediocre, I suppose. Well, am I having mediocre sex? I don't know. Maybe you are. But
to this day, though, people want to know what is normal, what is average, what's the normal number of times a married couple should have sex every week,
right?
Or whatever. Yeah, well, I'll tell you that I send a lot of my students in my lifespan class to look at Columbia University's site of Go Ask Alice, because it has a lot of questions about sex, drugs, maybe not rock and roll, but it has a lot of those kind of questions of what is normal, what is average. So even though Kinsey did that work so long ago, people today are still asking those questions.
Yeah, and I think that they're asking those questions because we'll never know what's normal. But I think the one thing that, even though try as he might, could not ever say is this sample that I got in my male book and my female book are at all representative of what is normal just because of his sample. So there might be average behaviors amongst his group. We don't know if that is normal for everyone. And of course, normal for everyone doesn't really mean anything.
It really doesn't. He wasn't really addressing happiness in relationships. He was only really addressing the sexual behavior, sex is only one piece of a healthy adult long-term relationship.
Right. And at that particular part really sums up this research, in that as psychologists, we know that if you want to define it as a marriage, if you want to define it as a partnership, if you want to define it as whatever you want, or even, a poly relationship. Define it however you want. Sex, as you said, is only going to be one part of it. And a true study on human sexuality does not ignore the relationship, the psychology, and the cultural and social environment.
Exactly.
Sex is a lot different for Europeans and Westerners than it is for some peoples in Africa or Southeast Asia or whatever. So I mean that plays a big role. Yeah, anatomy is fine. We all know how to make a baby, or we're told how to make a baby, I suppose, and we're shown down there at the cellular level what happens when a sperm meets an egg. But that's not the whole story.
It's not. And Masters and Johnson also did their work around a similar time on sexuality. They were coming at it from a very different viewpoint. They wanted to know physiologically what was going on in the male body and the female body.
Right.
But
so it was something that Kinsey didn't actually talk about was like, okay, when you are engaged in these acts, what is actually happening in the body? And the Masters and Johnson was the physiology of arousal.
Right. And you'd think as a biologist, he actually would have been interested in that.
He was stuck in those dang behaviors of the gull wasps.
Oh, it's all the gull wasps' fault.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, if he was just a taxonomist, which is what it seems like he was, the movie portrays him as just basically finding gull wasps, labeling them, and then putting them in a display case, like a display case that you would see at a museum or something. And so he really is just looking at these gull wasps, examining the outside, and then putting them in a display case.
Luckily, he didn't study humans the same way.
That's very true. Yeah.
It's advisable to stick to what's normal. You don't want to shake people up.
Of course not.
What did you expect?
The enforcers of chastity are massing once again.
All right, Leslie, we have time for one more segment, so I wanted to ask you any last parting concepts, themes, ideas in psychology that we could discuss about Kinsey?
Actually, I would like to bring up his quotes, even though they did not mention them in the movie. Okay, so there's a couple quotes of Kinsey's that he said that were not portrayed in the movie that I find really fascinating and shows how much his research really affected his own perspective on sexuality. So he said the only kinds of sexual dysfunction are abstinence, celibacy, and delayed marriage. So still, he was seeing marriage as the norm within the context of any sexual relationship.
Right.
And the other thing he said is the only unnatural sex act is one that you cannot perform. So it seemed that nothing was off limits.
Nothing was off limits, but also these are very crass statements when you pull them apart. Very, I disagree with both of them vehemently, because sexual dysfunction as abstinence, celibacy, and delayed marriage is kind of dumb. You can't have dysfunction when you don't do something. So to call abstinence sexual dysfunction is just so missing the point. Now, celibacy is a personal choice that some people take, and we can't say that they're dysfunctional because they decide that they don't want to have sex. I mean, asexual people exist. Some members of clergy do this and they want to, and that's their jam, and they're allowed to do their jam. You can't call them dysfunctional because of that. And then, if, as you said, delayed marriage. That's the most ridiculous thing ever.
I'm not even sure what that means. Like, how long of a delay is a delay? Oh no, I'm 23 and I'm still single.
Oh, you spinster.
Exactly. I'm an old maid.
Yeah, it really lacks any useful information. And probably just meant to be there to stir things up, because he was well known to stir things up with the release of these books. The other quote, "The unnatural sex act is the one you cannot perform." I disagree with that one, because some people just can't do some things, and that doesn't make them any less than.
No, of course not. Well, one of the things that we were talking about discussing was William Sadler's character.
Right. And the real life major issue with Kinsey's volumes was that he was interviewing pedophiles, and he had interviewed quite a few of them. And William Sadler plays a character who invites Kinsey and one of his research assistants to his office to have a conversation, to do the interview, and eventually tells them, or asks them, a really disgusting question about seeing a boy complete a sex act. I'm not going to describe the sex act. And the research assistant gets up and says, I'm not doing this. But Kinsey stays. And in real life, he interviewed a lot more than just this one person. This one person is supposed to represent a lot of people. And Kinsey didn't report them.
Yeah, which is shocking at this point, that you would listen to someone say, I've had sex with 600 boys or whatever. It was an incredible number that he kept this log in a book.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you're right. This character is a composite of many other characters that participants that he'd actually interviewed.
Mm-hmm.
But he sat there and listened. And when the man said, do I disgust you, or however he said it, Kinsey very, quietly said, I don't like it, but I'm still going to listen.
Yeah.
And which might have it almost looks like he's condoning it.
Yes.
Not, but if you're not reporting it, aren't you condoning it?
Yes. I'm going to go with yes.
I'm going to go with yes.
Yeah, it is, and it doesn't get enough in the movie. It's sort of pushed off to the side. It is it if director writer Condon said, I know I have to address this. I know this is a big part of these studies, but I kind of don't want to make a big deal out of it. We'll just have, Chris O'Donnell storm off, and we'll do this small exchange, and then nothing else.
It's never addressed again.
No, it is not discussed at all. And 2004, different time making movies. I think if they were to make a movie on Kinsey again, it would have to be on this subject.
Yeah, they'd have to address it. But for all we know, they did film something and it ended up on the cutting room floor.
Well, we can't talk about a movie that doesn't exist. And
exactly.
And this one really dropped the ball on that one for me, knowing that Kinsey interviewed a ton of these men who could have replaced some of the men that he does talk about who are in prison for sex-related or they were deemed sexual crimes and sexual offenses, even though by today's standard you wouldn't go to jail for those kinds of things. He was advocating for people to get out of jail for sodomy.
He was groundbreaking in his own way.
Of course, he wasn't very successful on that front, but it did eventually sodomy laws started to disappear. There are still some that exist in these United States. If you care to look at some state laws, there are still a handful of states that still have anti-sodomy laws.
A little scary.
Very much so. Well, Leslee, I want to thank you for joining me to discuss Kinsey. And before we say goodbye, is there anything that you'd like to plug? I always let guests talk about the work that they've been doing, things that they're proud of. What have you done recently?
Well, when I was on sabbatical a few years ago, I wrote a book. It is a sample of my students' writing, and each sample has a wine or drink pairing. So this book is called Pour a Glass, the Wine and Drink Pairing Guide for Terrible Writing, and you can find it on Amazon.
Oh, wonderful. Go ahead and send me a link of if you might. I'll go ahead and drop that into the show notes.
I will do that.
Thank you again for joining me, Leslee.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
That's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.